Our guest speaker this afternoon is Vana Carmona. She's involved in a number of local historic venues, Maine Historical Portland Observatory, and Eastern Cemetery. The last 6 years, she has pursued a major research project seeking out information on African Americans who were in Maine prior to 1800. They are all part of the Prince Project, her database of over 1,600 free and enslaved people living here through the post-revolutionary period. In her tours of the Eastern Cemetery, Vana uses this work to help educate people about the history of slavery in Maine, a topic she believes needs greater attention.
So as 2 years ago in 2018, in addition to my regular tours of Eastern Cemetery, I started doing a specialized tour that really covered the graves of the founding fathers and their role and complicity in slavery in Maine during this period up to 1800. It is still available on request if anyone actually wants to do it, but this is a PowerPoint presentation using the same material. So it's a virtual tour of the cemetery, and we'll use that as a jumping off point to discuss slavery in Maine in general. Now, a lot of people wonder how I got into this in the first place. You know, how does someone who runs around with a master's in medieval history, I mean, now that's a growth industry, as we know. I have 5 ancestors on the Mayflower. I've descended from 7 of the people, the Europeans, settlers to Newburyport, Massachusetts. We owned Nantucket Island at one point. How did I end up studying slavery in Maine? You know, so people sometimes say to me, well, how did you go from the Silk Road to the Middle Passage? But it actually is personal. And it was because of a gentleman named Prince. And that's why this is called the Prince Project. Okay? And that's Prince's grave. Now, he's in Eastern Cemetery, but not the Portland one. He's in Gorham. I was out there ferreting around for various members of the extended family, and I found Prince. And I said, who is this man? I've never heard of him before. Well, it didn't take me long to realize that my own ancestors were slave owners. And that really was kind of a shock because Grandma never mentioned it, and she was the great family genealogist. But I'd never heard of Prince, Dinah, and Chloe. And moreover, once I started poking around, I discovered that there were others. So I wanted to know more. I wanted to know more about these specific people. I wanted to know more about everybody. It just became an obsession. And so now here I am 6 years later with a database of 1,600 people. Some of these people were free and some were not, but I can pretty much guarantee you that there were no African Americans during that period who were making a point to come to the United States because it was the land of opportunity. Yeah. Okay? They were all forced here. So if you have someone who is a free person of color during this period, you have to know that somehow they're related to somebody who was stuffed onto the ships in Western Africa and taken across the Atlantic. So they count. That's my feeling. They count. So I started putting together so this is his grave. It's almost impossible to read it, but I did learn what it did say, and some of the information is wrong. That was the first thing. There's 2 stories. One of the stories is that he was purchased in Portland, and the other story is that a member of the family, a great-great-uncle of mine, asked another great-great-uncle who was a shipping magnate, it was the McClellan family of Portland and Gorham, that when he was down in the West Indies, would he bring him back one of these Negro people to help them? I'm going to go with that story. I like it. Go over to this map. So a lot of people didn't realize how extensive it was. But I have this map, and this will tell you just how extensive it was. I put together the statistics, and David Greenham up at the University of Maine put this map together for me, and no sooner did he do it last year where I discovered that there were a lot of people I needed to add, and he had to redo it recently. So this is the updated version. Usually you think of the major slave centers in Maine are probably the Kittery, Portsmouth area, because Portsmouth and Kittery were actually quite complicit in the slave trade. So was York and Wells. We had quite a bit of activity here in Portland and Falmouth. and Scarborough, by the way, which I brought a special tree for you about Scarborough. And then, of course, up in Warren. Warren became more in the early 1800s of an African-American community, and China, Maine, the same. But in the early days, it was always on the coast. Now, the other thing to keep in mind, that I have 1,600 people on this list, but where are the others? Because some of these people are so hard to find. I might just find their name once. You know, you don't find a lot of information about these people. So I figured that for every person I found, there has to be at least one other person that I cannot find, and maybe never will. It's an ongoing project, you'll see. Every time I start doing a binging on it, I tend to find somebody. There were so many. I mean, children died young. Let's just say you were born into a slave family, an enslaved family here in Maine. You grew up, maybe died young, you worked, you had your food and roof over your head. But if you had not been part of a bill of sale, were not baptized, didn't marry, was not in the will where you weren't left as the heirs, then you might not even know you existed. So I know there's many that I can't find. But that kind of bothers me, so I have to keep working at it. The other thing that also surprises me when I've talked to anyone about the work that I've done, it's so amazing to me that one of the first reactions is, oh, well, it wasn't like the South. And I'm not really sure what that's supposed to mean. Because if you're enslaved and you have no say in determining anything about your life, where you work, where you live, anything, then I don't know what difference it would make if you're enslaved, if you're in the North or the South. Yes, maybe down South you lived in a bunch of shacks or cabins in some kind of a community. Up here you probably lived in your owner's house because you didn't have these huge plantations. So, but I don't see how that is really making slavery any less awful. There are no degrees of slavery. You know, you either are enslaved or you're not. I've even had some people say that we treated our slaves better, which I also find a little bit shocking, really. I mean, I don't know what better is. I mean, there was a woman in Biddeford whose 5-year-old daughter was torn out of her arms by a respectable local citizen and taken off to the auction block. I have an incident of a woman who froze to death in Berwick because she couldn't find the cows. And that was sort of interesting because actually at the time that she died, she was legally a free person. But the slave culture, the mentality was still alive. Yes, there is a difference between the North and the South. We call the South a slave society. Slavery was part of their economic and their social structure. That really wasn't the case here. In Maine, we were what's called a society with slaves. They functioned more from menial work. Most people had 1, 2, I think the most I've ever found is maybe 11. Pepperell down in Kittery, he was notorious. Here there was more to do the menial work, the elite. They were actually status symbols in some cases. You dress them up and then you'd have them, be your livery person. Pepperell down in Kittery used to dress them up and then he'd have them row him down the river in his barge. Okay. So here in Maine, they were more useful and handy, but they weren't really essential per se. Now, for the record, slavery in Maine officially discontinued in 1783. And I say discontinued because it was kind of a question like, oh, well, gee, is it legal? Yeah, it's sort of legal. But wait a minute, we made this Constitution. The Constitution said that all people are free. Oops, we didn't really mean all people. We really meant all white people, but I guess we blew it. So we'll have to say that slavery is now delegalized. I mean, it was no longer, you couldn't say you had a slave. So officially all the people of color in Maine, Massachusetts were at that point free. So, but I do notice that I don't see huge changes in the first 10 years. By the time you look at the census of 1790, you see that the majority of people of color, African Americans, are still living in white households. Interestingly enough, 10 years later, that's not so much the case. You start seeing freestanding African American households in the census of 1800. So you see that it took a while for the idea of being a free black in Maine to actually manifest itself as someone who's living a more of a defined free life. That's why I cut off my research at 1800. First, because after 1800 it was just so overwhelming that even I couldn't do it. So let's go back to the cemetery. I don't know where that went. That's odd. I will look that up, get that back in there. Anyway, it was a picture of the entrance to Eastern Cemetery, which is located on Congress Street in Portland at the bottom of Munjoy Hill. And, okay, I'm going to do it. In the summer, we have daily tours there at, was it 11 this year? It's going to be 11 o'clock any day, 7 days a week. You go down to Eastern Cemetery at 11 o'clock and there will be someone there to give you a tour of the cemetery. Okay? Good. And if you want specialized tours, you just ask any of us and we'll make sure you get it. Or if you need private tours because the times don't work or you have family coming in, just speak up, we'll do it. So I'm going to go on now. Eastern Cemetery was declared a public burial ground officially in 1668. So it is one of the oldest historic sites we have in the city of Portland. It was probably used even before then, but that's when it was official. Now the first gentleman I'm going to talk about is this man. And the reason I want to talk about Moses Pearson is because I consider him kind of the epitome of everything that a slave owner was in Maine during this time. He has a gorgeous stone, as you can see. It's John Homer, I believe, was the carver of the stone. He came up from a very wealthy family. You're going to hear this over and over again. Came up from a very wealthy family in the late 1720s, 1727. Those were one of the key dates where you started seeing a lot more people coming up from Boston, Portsmouth, etc. They're already wealthy. They're not just looking, they're just looking to buy up some of the old land grants, etc. And became politically involved, became the leaders of the community, etc. And that's what he did. And he came up and became one of the major landholders in Portland, Falmouth at that time. He also, in 1745, he went off to the Battle of Louisburg, and for that, he was given a tract of land as his reward outside of Portland afterwards, and that town became known as Pearson Town, which most of us, probably you know what I'm going to say, is now Standish, Maine. So, he has this wonderful stone. Now remember that his public life and his private life were somewhat different. So the epitaph on his stone is talking about his mortal remains and how he departed this life, and he was 82, and he, having lived an exemplary and useful life, served his country. Think of all of that, my goodness. His works of piety and love remain before the Lord. Now, of course, what it doesn't mention here, and what you won't find in many history books, is he was also a major slave owner. We know that. I have a couple of examples of some of the people. I have 4 people that I can actually identify. The first 2 are in this document. It is an accounting. Thomas Shoup was a clothier in Falmouth at the time. And if you look and see, let's see if I can find it for you.
A pair of leather breeches you will see up there for your Negro slave. He got the leather breeches, and up at the top, your Indian boy, he got a jacket.
Okay. Native American, I can tell you he was a slave owner. That's a given. That's all I have for these 2 young men. I don't know their names, and they never came up again. But those were the two. So that's the kind of thing that I was running into, I have been running into now for the last 6 years. Another person that he enslaved was Rose. Now, I looked to see if I could actually find the original bill of sale, and it was not where it was supposed to be. So I don't know if it's been destroyed or lost or whatever. But I did find this in a book of the history at that time. So it tells you what the bill of sale actually said. So she came up from Boston, no surprise there, was sold by Jonathan Montfort, and yes, that is the same Montfort family that came up and Montfort Street is named for. And he paid 150 old tenor, that was the currency at the time. And that's there. Now she comes up again, she emerges later, and I don't have a copy of it to show you. In the First Parish Church, she was baptized about 6 years later in 1752. She was baptized at First Parish. Now this is something that I wanted to touch on about the slave system here, and in some ways in other places, in other slave systems in the world. But speaking of just the colonial slave system, in order to enslave somebody, you have to consider them inferior. You have to consider that somehow you are superior. So the first thing, and that is kind of true in general, it's very hard for you to, like I couldn't, like Peter over there, I couldn't enslave Peter. I know Peter, right? You know, I respect his, you know, his talents and his knowledge, etc. Why would I enslave him? I have to think that Peter is really inferior. He's really not like me. And then you have to start somewhere, and that's the usual place you have to start. And the Europeans in general thought that they were blessed with this responsibility to take these infantile, simple people from Africa and guide them. That they saw their role almost as like this good, positive thing for these people. Later on, you'll see that there became like medical studies as to why the African brain was substandard compared to the white brain. So one of the sociologists that I've read talked about what's called a social death. In order to enslave somebody, you have to create a social death. Ideally, you take them away, you strip them of all identity, where they live, their family, their religion, their name, and you rename them. And so they have nothing. Where are they going to go? Well, how are they going to even escape this situation? Like throwing yourself off the ship, if you could do that on the way over, and some did. But so here we are. This was their role. The Europeans were there to save them. So one of the things you always try to do is to get them into the church. So very commonly, and for me it's wonderful that I have baptism records, because otherwise there'd be a lot more people lost to us today that we would never know about. Of course, once they became Christian, and some of them became incredibly Christian and went to church all the time, took the covenant, etc., but you couldn't sit with the regular white people, of course. You had to sit somewhere else. There's an incident, and I think it was in Scarborough, where there was a gentleman, I could have this wrong, it might be another town. He had a very young African-American child that somehow he was sort of fond of. Maybe it was his son, you don't know. But he couldn't sit in the pew with him in the church, but he could sit in the aisle, you know. So, and then of course when you die, you don't get to get buried with everybody else in the cemetery. You've got to go down to the back. Or if it happens to be a family plot, then maybe just outside. And then the other thing that also is that you bury them either behind the barn. I have a gentleman who was walking from Gorham to Scarborough, and an elderly man died of probably a heart attack or a stroke or something, and they just buried him next to the road. So his name was Nimrod, if anyone Makes them cute. Might know, yeah, that's pretty sad. So anyway, so she was baptized. Then later on, you will find this gentleman, and he is the fourth one that I have for Moses Pearson. And he was bought, here's his bill of sale. He was bought from James Noyes in Newbury. Yes, that is the Noyes family. Paid only £8 for him, so he was kind of a real bargain. I'm not quite sure what that was all about. And later on, I find that in 1772, I find a marriage record of Rose and Scipio. So they were actually married by James Dean at, James Dean? No, he's a motorcycle man. How about Samuel Dean? Let's try that. Samuel Dean at First Parish Church. So that kind of had a semi-happy ending. It's also possible that Scipio later on ended up being enslaved by Francis Waldo in Stroudwater. Francis Waldo was quite a slave owner, and he died in 1784, so the dates kind of work. I don't have a lot of Scipios in Portland. It's a relatively common slave name, but that's I don't have a lot here. Waldo did have slaves. He sold the house to Daniel Doyle, his son-in-law. He usually kept them living in the attic. He had a special room up there that he had walled off, and it had a fireplace in it, which is not at all uncommon either. In fact, I will show you his house. There is the Waldo house down on the lower part. So it would have been up in the attic on that third floor. And that over there is the Tate House attic.
Yeah.
Sometimes you can go up there. The problem is it only has one entrance and exit, so they don't like to take people up there. But you can, under special arrangements, they will. That's the hallway. I was with Tate House for quite a while. Not anymore. And then that was like the hallway, and there's two little rooms you see off to the left. And that's where the people that they enslaved lived. There was at least one that I absolutely know of, a second one that I'm pretty confident of, and then the son William actually had listed two, but they could be the same ones. He might have been borrowing them, you see. So that's kind of how, or you lived in an L, but usually you tended to live in the house itself with the owners. That doesn't make it better, it just makes it the way it was. Now the next stone we're going to go talk about is this one here. This is a before and after. On the left is the way it should be. On the right is the way it is now, thanks to vandals, which is an ongoing problem. The Gooding family, surprisingly enough, were actually major shipbuilders in Falmouth, and I had not heard of them a lot there for a while, but I guess he was one of the major shipbuilders for a good 50 years and was also involved in training future shipbuilders as well. I believe he came up, I'm not really sure where he came up from, but I think it was Boston, and he had a woman named Ruth that lived in their house. And the reason we know that is because we have a marriage, I have that actually too, I have a marriage thing. Let's go look at that. That they were actually married. Where are we here? I found this. They were actually married in 1737. Now, as you can see, Ruth belonged to the Goodings, and Prince belonged to the Dabneys, Robert and Mary Dabney. They were shopkeepers on 4th Street, and the first thing, and they're not buried in Eastern Cemetery, by the way, but one thing that struck me is like shopkeepers on 4th Street, they don't really seem like they would be elite enough to really be enslaving people. So I was a little surprised at that until I learned that they were the Dabney family that came from North Yarmouth. North Yarmouth was not a quiet, sleepy little town so much. It was actually quite the hotbed of slavery. I found a number of people there that enslaved people. And Robert actually only came to Portland because his wife had property on what's now India Street. Now, Prince may or may not have been the only person that Robert Dabney actually enslaved. There is another person, because I found a letter that was dated 1730 in which his brother John discussed a slave that he had purchased and given to his brother Robert. And this enslaved person was misbehaving. And he's complaining about this bad behavior. So now, is this naughty slave the same as Prince? I'm tending to think not, because of this. This is the Dabney letter who manumitted Prince in 1744. So if he was so badly behaved, either he did an about-face in his conduct, or he's somebody else. Maybe he shipped the bad slave, sold him off, and got the good slave, Prince, right? But in 1744, he actually freed him and gave him some land and some money. Oh, I gotta speed up so you guys won't get too bored. So, now keep in mind that when two people got married, it didn't necessarily mean they got to live together. Ruth continued to live with the Goodings, for sure, and Prince continued to live with the Dabneys, for sure. And it didn't protect them from being sold. It didn't protect their children from being sold. In fact, marriage among enslaved people kind of had its own rules. They may have been married, but they could also be unmarried very, very quickly if the owners decided to do anything, decided to sell them or whatever. And keep in mind is that their children, the children belong to the mother's owner. And that is how Elizabeth Deering here in Scarborough ended up with so many slaves, because she got all the children that were the children of Hagar and Black Caesar. So we'll look at that in a second. So I don't know what happened to Ruth. She may have passed away, but in any case, just because her husband was free doesn't mean that she was. She could have continued to be enslaved by the Goodings. Now, because we're in Scarborough, I added some things on here. So this is the great marriage agreement I love between Richard King and Richard Elvins and their slaves Hannah and Boston in 1768. If you read this carefully, you'll see that they made a wonderful, when they married their two slaves, which of course had to live in their separate households, that they would never have to live more than one parish apart. That was incredible generosity at that time. So I found that here, I finally had to do one of my little flow charts. Okay, I did this flow chart so I could figure out who was who here in Scarborough. So we had the Prouts, the Deerings, the Kings, and the Elvins. Now we have Black Caesar, who married Hagar. They had to live separately, of course, because that was the rule. Hagar and Black Caesar had all these children. They
did get together occasionally.
Obviously. Maybe they got to live one parish apart. So, anyway, but these children all belonged to Elizabeth Deering. They weren't shared. Could they be sold? Oh, yes, indeed. Look, she sold them. She had no problem. We have Robert, who was sold over to Mr. King. He became Robert Jackson. He married his other slave, Amy Hackett. She sold Hannah. Hannah's the one who married Boston and only had to live one parish apart. We have Hagar herself with her two daughters, and these two daughters were sold also to King.
So, and then this here is the son of Amy and Robert, and he also belonged to King. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Do you know how long it took to do that? But that's the kind of thing where it gets so complicated that I actually have a number of these kinds of charts because I can't keep track of them. And I actually have here, this is the bill of sale of Hagar and her 2 daughters. And I also have here, this is the bill of sale of Robert and Hannah. So that's your special Scarborough treat today.
I have a question.
Yes, go right ahead.
Would the purpose behind having slaves or allowing them, having them be married simply for convention because they were baptized? So if they're living together, maybe they should be married because that's what's in the Bible?
Well, yes. But of course, then they could unmarry them if they felt like it, of course, because that was the rules. I don't know. I think a lot of the situations differed. I have one situation where I think, they actually had met and they actually wanted to be married to each other, and this was something that the owners decided that they would agree to because the owners had to decide, because it wasn't up to them to decide, because you can't decide anything. At the other hand, I think I've seen a couple of instances, including in my own family, where it looked like I have the suspicion that Dinah, Prince's first wife, may have been brought up specifically from the West Indies to marry him so that he'd have somebody. I'm not absolutely 100% sure of that. Keep him happy. But maybe he didn't have a choice. He'd rather be with Chloe. And whatever happened to Dinah, I don't know. I can't find any. There's a record there that says she died, but that's kind of interesting because he was already married to Chloe. So marriages were a little bit fluid. Okay.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay. This is Reverend Thomas Smith. It's a terrible picture. I'm sorry. I couldn't get the sun to stop shining that day. But he was another one of the worst. Of course, he came up in, here we go again, an elite Boston family, came up in late 1720s, started the first parish church. And this ledger, by the way, is a copy. And he lived till he was 95 years old, died in 1795. I had someone say that was because he was scared of what awaited him. He waited so long. Okay, but he came up from Portland, started the first parish church, but we've discovered that he is not the man that history has tried to describe. You know how Martin Luther King said something about no lie lives forever? Well, his didn't either. Even last year in the Portland Press Herald, there was a huge article about how the First Parish Church is really trying to deal with the real founder of the church. That he worked openly against the Native American population here. He even went so far as to profit from the bounties that were put on the scalps of the Native Americans that were brought to the town. He was getting like 200 pounds a scalp, which is 25% of his church income. So he was really making out like a bandit. He was also a slave owner, and I have several that I can definitely attest to. One is another Hagar, different one, that was kind of a common name. And he baptized her in the church himself, and he even said when he logged it in, that she was belonging to myself. The next one he had was Romeo, and Romeo went off to the Revolutionary War. That was very, very common. A lot of the enslaved people would go off to the Revolutionary War with the idea that they would be freed if they fought and won, of course. And so he decided to go off, and he had Reverend Smith said, "Fine. Of course," he says, "you can go, but you have to give me half your wages." So he profited even from that. Of course, no one knew that a few years later, in 1783, they would have been freed anyway. However, one of the things I love about Romeo is that Smith was always complaining about how Romeo had such a hard time working because he had such bad rheumatism, which I thought was hilarious. But when the Revolutionary War came, he was able to go off and be a soldier without any problem at all. So I have to give him a hand on that one. In his diary, The last one that I could definitely find is a man named Jack. And here's just a picture of his diary. I tried to see if there's an original diary, and there isn't, unfortunately. And in 1774, he wrote on November 16th, he wrote, "Our Negro man Jack died." And that's how we know that there was a Jack. That's another one of those instances like the Indian child and that belonged to Pearson, that all we have is just one little small note. But that's okay. He made the database. He's on it. Slavery ran in families. So if you tended to grow up in a family that enslaved people, you tended to have them yourself. You tended to also, because this is a small knit community, but if you grew up with them, it probably seemed fairly normal. Reverend Smith had 2 sons. He had another Thomas and a Peter, and they were all slave owners. Thomas Smith actually married the daughter of another slave owner. They lived in Windham, and we know that when he died, he left, quote, "a Negro man and a likely young Negro woman." They were valued at 150 old tenor. So, and it looks like the dad actually purchased them. So there's 2 more for him. His other son, Reverend Smith's other son, Peter, had 2 that we know of. One named Flanders, who went off to the Revolutionary War and served for a good 3 years. And then his wife, Elizabeth, she had a very famous screen painted. This is it. It's a very interesting piece. Has anyone ever seen this? No. Okay. This woman's black, but I don't know if maybe she was particularly light-skinned, or that also what was common is you would white out the faces when you painted them. So I'm not sure. This is the fire screen. It's life-size. It's fantastic. It's up in Windham. Belongs to Historic New England, I believe.
Is it a Brewster?
I'm sorry?
Is it a Brewster?
I don't think so. You mean the Brewster painting?
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't think it's ever been said. I didn't read anything about that, but that would be curious to look and see if it is. But anyway, and she belonged to the wife. And it's fantastic that we have this because there's hardly anything like that. Then we're going to go on to Samuel Dean took over from Reverend Smith. They were co-pastors there for a long time, and then when Smith died, he took over until his death in 1814. This is his ledger. He had a woman in his, a child actually, in his household, but it was after 1783, so I can't consider her enslaved. Her name was Sylvie, and he baptized her himself. She was born sometime around 1775, so she could have been born into slavery, but she was baptized in 1786. And he noted that he had baptized her, and that he wrote that, quote, she was his African servant child. So they became servants. Actually, they were always servants. You'll be careful, because when people say, oh, they were just servants. No, when they have servant for life, that's a slave. There was just what would Malcolm X say? You can put a shoe in an oven, it doesn't make it a biscuit. So, you don't call them servants, but they're still slaves. Okay. Interestingly, Sylvia may have come from Brunswick, and that actually had quite a community. It was another big slave-owning community. Many of the major people up there, the Stones, the Dunnings, the Larrabees, they were all slave owners. And after these people were freed and liberated, many of them stayed there. So that's where you get the Griffin family, the Freeman family, and the Hill family, which, if you've done any research on African American people here in Maine, those names are going to come up very common. And then they moved from Brunswick outward. The next person is Moody. Major Moody. He came up here earlier than most people, but in the early 1700s, because he was in charge of the fort. Now he had, and I know we're running short on time, sorry about that, but we are. He had another political leader in the community. He stayed after the fort closed. He actually, he was married to Esther Green, These are all very wealthy families. He became a major landowner, and he was a political leader of the community, as I said. We know that he had at least 3 people he enslaved. They were in his will. One, we have a black man, 1 black woman, and 1 mulatto woman. They used the term mulatto back then. Of course, it's racially mixed, as we know. It's not a nice term. It's a Spanish word that means mule, a cross between a horse and a donkey, and its only value is work and is sterile. In case you equine people out there. However, I also discovered that there was a child who was born in his house in 1726, and she was named Tryphena. And there was something fishy that went on there, but I can't quite figure out what, because he was wondering, what on earth should I do with this, this child? So maybe it was his. You don't know that. But what's interesting is a few years later, 7 years later, after his death, it appears that his son took over a child named Tryphosa, who he was taken into his become a charged. He was responsible for her religious, or its. I love that, its religious education, not her religious, but its religious education. I have a funny feeling that this was handwritten, and when someone transcribed it, they couldn't read it, and that Tryphena and Tryphosa are the same person. It would make sense, unless she had a sister who had, and that was just the way of, doing the names. Next one over is, this is the oldest stone in the cemetery, by the way. Stephen Larrabee. He didn't have any slaves that I do know of, but his son certainly did. I mean, he may have, but I haven't been able to find them. Benjamin Moody went up to Brunswick, and he became the commander at Fort George. And he had a Negro servant, as it was referred to, named Pompey. And he was at the fort, and he was there definitely in the 1730s. But I do have a marriage intention that was filed for him in 1749, in which he was intending to marry a woman named Sylvie, or Priscilla, and that she was owned by Michael Malcolm, and he was in Georgetown. Later on, Benjamin Larrabee's son, Nathaniel, listed in the 1771 tax rolls that he had also 1 lifetime servant, quote unquote. So the saga continued for at least a couple generations there. We also have Phineas Jones. He will be the last white person that we will be talking about. He came up again, wealthy families, 1720s, became very promising politically. He was a prominent Boston family. He came up to North Yarmouth, and then he came down to Portland. He was an early real estate developer. He died suddenly, and we do know that he enslaved somebody because this man was named Cambridge, and it was listed in his will. He was listed as part of his estate and given to his family. Now, there's actually 2 sections in the cemetery that are dedicated to the African Americans. One is in the old section. Originally, you came in from the lower gate, and if you did, you would turn right and go as far away as you possibly could to get to this far corner, and that's where you could put some African Americans. And then when they added the higher ground that had belonged to Reverend Smith, and it was annexed in 1795, then it was like, oh, way back in that far corner, we'll start putting some too, because that's getting a little busy. Well, of course, with karma being what it is that after 1866 and the big fire, they switched the entrance. The back became the front, and the front the back. And so then all of a sudden you have the second African American section in the front of the cemetery, which it is to this day. Now, up in that section, you will find these 2 fellows. Plato McClellan, yes, he's another one that belonged to my family. In fact, he belonged to Carrie McClellan, who is a direct grandfather of mine, and his buddy Cato Shattuck. Now, Cato Shattuck was in Falmouth, and Plato was here. Now, these are Veterans Administration stones, by the way. These are not their stones. Are they even buried here in Eastern Cemetery? I really honestly don't know. The McClellan family tended to bury their slaves across the street from their house. It doesn't necessarily mean anything, but there's that. And Cato, I lost track of him after the Revolution. I don't know if he moved away, changed his name, or had died. I don't really know. But they did enlist together. And they were actually in Valley Forge together. So they really suffered for their freedom. I have a theory about who Cato Shattuck may have been, and it's pure speculation, but I'm sticking to it. I'm gonna go over. I'm gonna skip this. I'm gonna have a quick look here. Those are the two McClellan stones. This is Stephen, and that really horribly destroyed one is Hugh McClellan. But we're gonna go on straight away to this, another one of my spreadsheets, to try to explain the McClellan family. The Portland ones and the Gorham line, they were cousins, and I'm related to both sides. So we had here Prince, Dinah, and Chloe, who belonged to William. We have Plato that belonged to his brother. We have over here Joseph and Mary. Joseph had a servant who was on the retrieve with him at the Battle of Bagaduth. I'm suspecting it may have been Cato Shattuck, because I'm trying to figure out how Plato and Cato Shattuck got to be so close that they went off and enlisted together. Now, they would have definitely known each other very well, because Mary and Abigail married their cousins Joseph and James. So these families were tight-knit in more ways than one, as you can see. So they definitely would have known each other. So somehow I've got this idea that Cato Shattuck may very well be the one that was on the retrieve with Joseph. That's my philosophy. Hugh McClellan owned a gentleman named Limbo, and his other son, Alexander, owned Primus. Primus was over here. I have Limbo Stone. He was buried up in Freiburg, finally a free man. He ran away from my great-great-grandfather because he believed he should be free, but for some inexplicable, and my grandfather, the story is he didn't go after him because he considered that he was stupid and useless. I don't know, he could have been right, because somehow Limbo got out there and got himself enslaved twice more. So, okay, and what was really interesting is the last time when he was sold, he was actually a free man. So how did he do that? But he somehow, for someone who thought he was free and that he's being sold around even after he actually is free, that's kind of a mystery to me. But the good news is, he died a free man. And people loved him enough that they got a stone for him. So he's up in Freiburg. And then I also have Primus. This belonged to an uncle, the Alexander McClellan. This is Primus's bill of sale. He was sold to one of the Deerings, Nathaniel Deering. They were once at one time buried in Eastern Cemetery, but then it appears that they moved a lot of the bodies over to Evergreen Cemetery when that opened, which was not uncommon because I'm not seeing them there now. Over here, next to Plato and Cato, I have Louis Shepherd, and he is a Scarborough guy. Anyone know him? You don't? Louis joined up with Plato and Cato, and he was also at Valley Forge. He's a good one, and there's lots of good information about him. That's what I like about him. So if anyone, any student wants to do a presentation, he's the one. How did he get there? He was born in Jamaica, and he ended up being owned by Enoch Libby here in Scarborough. He came back from the war, and he was given a house by the Libbys. And be careful when you see those kinds of references. Oh, they came back, and the owners, the former owners gave him a house. No, they let him live in a house. They didn't give him a house. I know that my family certainly would, because they were always cheap. They wouldn't give you a house. They'll let you live in it, but the house is still going to be theirs, because you don't find any deeds. That's what's interesting. But so you think, oh, how nice, how kind. No, he didn't get to, he just got a place to live. So be careful, because that's very misleading. But nonetheless, he did live to see his freedom. He did move to Portland. He worked on the docks like so many. He lived in Munjoy Hill, which was the working class neighborhood at the time, and that is where you found a large African American population at that time. He even got his pension in 1818, and the story has it that his wife took it and used it to buy the stone, and he actually is buried there where you find the stone in Eastern Cemetery. Now, he was married twice, but I also suspect maybe it was the same woman. First woman that he supposedly married was Betty Lewis, and she also was owned by Enoch Libby. And they were married at the First Congregational Church here in Scarborough. Found the church records. However, his second wife was also named Elizabeth. It was Elizabeth Ruby, and otherwise known as Marm Shepherd. That's how she became known later on. I have a funny feeling that Betty Lewis and Elizabeth Ruby were the same person. I think that when they transcribed these records, or when maybe they even noted them, why does Betty have the same last name as her husband's first name? That's kind of a curiosity to me. Sounds like someone was writing things and they got them confused. And that he really only married Marm Shepherd. I don't find any specific marriage intentions to Marm Shepherd, and I don't see any death of Betty Lewis. So I think they could well have been the same person. Betty Lewis, by the way, used to dance. So that there's records that she would go out and dance, and when she danced, I think it was Pepperell or somebody like that from Kittery used to give her a bandana for dancing. Really nice. Marm Shepherd, though, Ruby is a really important name. She would have been the sister of Boston Ruby. Boston Ruby was the father of Reuben Ruby. Anyone who studies any kind of African American history in Portland knows Reuben Ruby. He was very involved. He was a major abolitionist. He was helped found the Maine Anti-Slavery Society, the Portland Union Anti-Slavery Society in 1841. He actually had some relatively important national renown. He came back, he actually helped start the Abyssinian Society and the meeting house that we have down next to the cemetery. Now, Marm Shepherd, it says, was buried next to him. This is not true. Marm Shepherd is buried in the old section, the lower section, and this is what her grave looks like. Nothing. There actually was, I could see at one time, there was a stone that she did have a gravestone. What you see here, this little round thing, that was done in, when did they do, the city do it? Was it 1900 that they did?
1890, 1900.
Yeah, the city did a survey of the cemetery and marked. So obviously there was something there that said she was buried there because it has the city marker. But this is more how I find so many of what I do find African American graves. This is how they look. You will even find, so she's down there in the old section. I have a picture of the old section from above, from up on the hill, and you look down and you say, oh, there's hardly anybody there. Well, actually, it's chock-a-block full. It's just you can't see any markers. Most of them are probably wood or fieldstone. The oldest known marker, I would say oldest known burial, because the marker's gone, was 1795. So again, they were burying their people on their farms, next to the road, or here, but without any kinds of markers. Also down there we have, this is Nancy Pierre. She was the first wife of Christopher Christian Manuel, and he is another one like Reuben Ruby, who was very instrumental in the Abyssinian Meeting House, in abolition, the Portland Union Anti-Slavery Society. These were some of the people who were very, very involved. He was actually the first president of that union. This was his first wife. And sadly, she, I will really hand it to Spirits Alive and their conservation people for actually finding enough pieces to put it together as much as this. This is as good as we could get. But that stone had been severely damaged. Her husband's grave, she died 22, poor babe. And he went off and married again. I keep laughing because you'll understand in a minute. This is his memorial stone, Christian Emmanuel. He is up in the newer section, and he's part of. They put it here because he's part of the Freedom Trail marker. So if you ever get the little pamphlet and want to do the Freedom Trail, you'll end up with a stop here. It says here that he was born in Cape Verde, which is a series of islands off the coast of Senegal, which was a major slave hub coming out of West Africa. But it turned out that that's not true. He and his wife, his second wife, Sophie, I'm very good friends with. I don't know, anyone know Bob Green? Bob Green is a descendant of these people. And when they were tearing down the old house on Munjoy Hill years ago, they found Sophie, the second wife's diary, and it said that he was actually born in St. Thomas. So, and there was saying that he was actually a little younger than they thought, which is okay because Sophie Ruby, whose stone is right next to his, was only 14. Was only 14 when she married him, and he was at least 20 years older than she was. He was in his mid-30s, or he could have even been older, depending on which version you want to believe. So I just put her in there. She's way too young to be on the database, but I thought, anyone that marries at 14, they really deserve some kind of recognition. So that's why she's got it. Sophie's great. So that's it. That's all I have to say about that for the moment. Stay tuned. I might come up with more in a couple of years. But that's my contact information. If anyone has anything to add, subtract, I would love to hear it. There's some great gravestones out in cemeteries out in the Black Point area. There's a lot going on out there with slavery, and it would be, if anyone's interested in helping pursue that specifically, that would be great. So, okay. Anything else? Yes. Okay.
You sort of answered this, but I was wondering how many of the descendants you've come in contact with. You mentioned one just now.
I'm sure there's quite a few. I don't know specifically. I haven't sat down and said, who did you descend from? I just happen to know Bob, and he was when I was test running my tour in the cemetery. I gave it to him first to critique and whatever. So we've been in touch a lot. But there's quite a few. I know that Rachel Talbot, she's definitely descendant from the Talbots in general. Long-term here. There's a book out there that was done by Gerald Talbot and what's the other name? The other woman, Harriet. Why am I drawing a blank? She called Maine Visible Black History. So if you are interested, that has a tremendous amount of information. It was like my first original go-to book, and that will tell a lot of the families. In fact, there's even it talks about a lot of the families. One of them is the Macaulay family which is actually an interesting story. They're in Augusta, and I heard about them, and there's a lot of write-ups in the Visible Black History book about them. And I went, I wonder if maybe I could trace them back to one of the people on my list. Well, I couldn't. I can only get back into the 1880s, because that's when the grandfather came over from Nigeria, and that is an incredible story unto itself. But what's also really interesting is that the grandson married my mom's cousin, which I thought was like, oh, wow, this is cool. I'd always heard about that, it was always, and my family, they weren't close because, well, that's another story, that's another lecture entirely, but they weren't close. But I always kind of knew that there was this, but I didn't know the whole thing about the whole Nigeria connection. So there's a lot around. If anyone's interested in really reading about it, it's pretty cool.